Hello and welcome to Transforming Worlds. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking to Inez Aponte. She's an educator, storyteller, and barefoot economist. Inez is a research fellow at the Schumacher Institute, combining her in-depth knowledge of community change-making with 25 years of performance storytelling to deliver groundbreaking trainings that combine ecological economics, embodied learning, neuroscience, and social psychology. She works with a wide range of international audiences, including refugees, business leaders, community organizers, and development workers. In 2021, together with her teenage son, she co-founded Crazy Beautiful World, an intergenerational project aimed at finding wise and compassionate ways to navigate the challenges ahead. She currently hosts the Beautiful Economies Learning Lab, a 6-week embodied inquiry into the roots of our economic stories. One of the labs is starting shortly, so I definitely recommend you check it out. And you're going to find information in the show notes, as usual. Join us now for a delightful conversation on very difficult topics like how we organize our world, our economics, how we combine the weird and the wonderful, the power of storytelling, and of course, intergenerational wisdom. Tune in. Welcome, Inez. So happy to have you at Transforming Worlds. Tell us about you and what's transforming for you these days.
Hi, Carola. Thank you for having me. What's transforming for me these days? There's a lot of things going on right now on a personal level. My son is 19. He's just left home. So suddenly I'm, as a mother, moving into a different phase of my life. I have, after 20 years, created a one-woman show about my grandmother's slave heritage, and I'm about to start touring that. And the thing that probably might be of most interest to the listeners here is I have put my Beautiful Economies work online after 15 years of doing it in person with people. And that's been quite a big step for me because I've always really felt that the real learning happens when we are together, being in the room, all that sort of interaction and the presence of other people is so important to me in learning. However, with COVID, and then I just realized people were asking me from all over the world to do this work. And I thought, I'm not going to get on a plane. So let's find a midway. So I then developed this work with students from the Schumacher College, which used to be around the corner. And it seems to be working. I seem to have found some way of still creating that embodiment online. So that's kind of like a new thing for me. And I'm really excited about that.
Wow, that sounds amazing. It sounds like you're in a space of a lot of reflection and in holding space for yourself, for your ancestral story, and now for people in a new medium online. And it's such an important work at this time to be holding space for ourselves and for each other. So it's really fascinating that you're moving into that sort of new adventure for yourself.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Your work is multifaceted, to say the least. So doing the research for this episode, I was really trying to look for the common denominator, and you and I talked about how what we appreciate and what we value is changing. What is the trigger of that new interpretation, new perspective of value for you? What led you there?
Perhaps I should backtrack a bit and tell you how I even got into this notion of that we should be thinking about value or what is valuable. So when my son was a little baby, at that point I'd been working as a storyteller. So that really was my first profession. And I just want to say, when I say storyteller, I don't mean a marketeer. I don't mean a writer. I don't mean a filmmaker. I was literally telling stories. And those stories were stories from the oral tradition, which every country and every culture would have. And some of those lineages of storytelling have been interrupted, and some of them have carried on, but probably in the West, mostly they were interrupted by things like writing and television and industrialization. So I had been working as a storyteller for about 10 years at that point. And I was invited to watch a film at a friend's house. An Inconvenient Truth. Have you seen it?
Yes.
It was the first kind of climate change film. And as I was sitting there with my little 1-year-old on my lap, I watched that graph go up, when he gets on the lift and the numbers start to go up.
Yeah.
And I was looking and I thought, that's my child's future. And I thought, that is not a livable planet. And I literally just started to weep. And I wept through the rest of that movie. I took my little baby home and I was like, what are we going to do about this? And this is 19 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to think a lot about how I was really ripped apart by that realization. But the people I'd watched that film with seemed to be carrying on as normal. And these were good people. These were my friends. There was nothing about them that wasn't about them not caring.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought there must be something else going on that somehow keeps the information locked away so that we can keep functioning in this society. And I became mildly obsessed with with that notion. And I thought, as a storyteller, I thought the only way that can happen is if there's a really good story that somehow makes this all okay. And I realized the story that is somehow telling us we should be able to carry on as we are is the story of economics. And that is how I ended up becoming what I now call a barefoot economist. And that is how I developed the work that I develop now, that I do now, which centers around the human scale development framework, which focuses on, rather than looking at GDP, it looks at how do we meet our 9 fundamental human needs. And that is where I started to think the way that we meet our needs now is so wrapped up in the system. The economic system tells us what we should pay attention to and tells us what is valuable, even if deep down we have a whole different set of values. We find ourselves having to go to work, possibly in a job that we don't even like that much, possibly for a company that we don't really believe in, because we have to pay the bills. And now, perhaps some of your listeners might be in a fortunate position where they don't have that. They have the privilege of being able to choose maybe an employer, or they're self-employed and they work with clients they believe in. But the majority of people on the planet don't. To ask people to think outside of that very narrow box of the economy and to start thinking about, oh, how do we fix climate change, which is not an
Right.
immediately felt in their lives, I thought that's almost impossible.
Yeah.
So for a while I was talking about climate change and I thought, okay, stop it. People either get it or they don't. And nothing I say and none of the facts are shifting the dial here at all. I thought I
What
need to think about the story. So yeah.
so what do the soles of our feet have to do with the barefoot aspect of barefoot economics?
Okay, yes, that's a good question. So Barefoot Economics was created by a number of academics and practitioners in Latin America in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. It's also known as human scale development.
Yes.
The person who's most well known for this work is a Chilean economist called Manfred Max Neef. And he tells a story of working one day. He'd was I think Harvard educated and taught at Berkeley, so he's a very sort of like high up in his field. He was working in Peru, in some of the poorest villages in Peru. And one day it had rained and rained and rained, and the ground had turned to mud outside. So he stepped out of where he was staying and he was walking down the street and he bumped into a young man that he knew. And this man had no shoes on. He was standing with his bare feet in that mud. And at that moment, Manfred looked at him and thought, he knew that this man had a wife, 4 children, a mother-in-law to look after, and no job. And he thought, what should I say to him? Here I am, this great economist, and should I tell him that he should be glad that GDP has risen? And he thought, I have actually nothing to say. He says, I looked into the eyes of poverty and I had nothing to say. And it was a real epiphany for him. And he thought, I have to find another way of talking about the economy that makes sense to those people, rather than being an economist in an ivory tower. So the barefoot economy notion comes from the idea that we should step into the mud with our bare feet so that we are able to understand the conditions of the people that we are trying to help. So
Can we?
it's a
Do you
very
think we
different.
can? Do you think we can?
I think we have to make that attempt to understand those conditions. And the framework, I feel really helps us understand the human condition
Hmm.
because it focuses on these 9 needs, which it says we all have in common with each other. The only difference is we have different ways of satisfying those needs, which are the cultures that we've developed. So that distinction between needs and satisfies is really important, because we tend to talk about needs as if they're just given. And people often say things like, oh, I need a car. And that's not a need in the human scale development framework. Nobody needs a car. A car is a satisfier for a more fundamental need. And you can start to pick that apart, basically. And by picking that apart, you're not judging the person, because you're like, well, that is, it must meet some of your needs. But you're saying, okay, well, there are consequences to using a car, and those consequences will have different impacts on those different needs. So perhaps it'd be good if I just explain what those
Yes,
needs
please
are
do.
for listeners.
Yes.
Yeah. So the need for subsistence, which we're all familiar with. There's also the need for protection. We all want to feel safe. We have a need for participation. We all want to have a voice, have a say in how our societies work. We have a need for affection. We want to feel loved and appreciated. Have a need for creation, to express ourselves. A need for understanding, to be able to make sense of the world. A need for idleness. So we need to be able to relax and rest. And we have a need for identity. We want to feel that we belong, that we know who we are. We have a need for freedom to choose. If you look at it that way, it's hard to argue that if those needs were met, that would be a pretty good state of well-being, right?
It seems to me that the needs are carried and held by love and life and livelihood, and that the satisfiers are carried and held by fear, by structures, by constructs, also stories. So how do we make it see the difference between these stories? Which stories are resonant and true and can be held in our hearts, and which stories are colonial, dictatorial, forceful, violent, confining, enslaving?
Yeah. So just to be clear, the satisfiers are not by definition
Oh, no.
sort of violent.
Right.
So what I do in the Beautiful Economies Learning Lab is we have an opportunity to think first about what are the dominant stories in the economy right now. What are we all being told is the right way to live? And how has that impacted us? What choices have we made?
Right.
And there are, as many stories as there are people. There tends to be among the people who I find in my learning lab, who are people who have thought about this already. There tends to often be, well, I made this choice because I needed to make money. If I didn't have to make money, I would, fill in the blanks,
Yes.
usually something beautiful and creative and life-giving.
Yes.
So that in itself is a really important point of conversation. If you were to do one thing to think about shifting the system, you could just have that conversation with people. What did you choose because of the way the economic system is designed now? And what would you choose if you didn't have to worry about money? Because money has its function. There's nothing inherently, well, we can go in it, we're not going to go too much into that. We can go into the way money is created and how that impacts, but money can be used as a tool.
Yes.
But the way it's functioning now, it's actually become a tool of oppression.
Right.
Because the ways that we would normally originally have met our needs might have been, in fact, I come from a family where just 2 generations ago, my grandmother was living off the land, a bit of hunting from her sons, and maybe the occasional bit of peanut butter from the market and salt, that kind of thing. And 2 generations later, there is no way I would know how to grow food. I've become totally de-skilled. I need to get money to meet my needs. So that's kind of a process. And you often see that when you see the kind of land grabs that happen in parts of the world where people push people off that subsistence level and they go into the cities and then they have to work. Whereas, but actually before they might have had like less than $1 a day or whatever, but maybe they were meeting their needs differently.
Right.
So the metric by which we're trying to understand their conditions already goes by, oh, the only way we can understand this is through the metric of money.
Right.
And human scale development is saying, oh, hold on a minute. If your needs are met, regardless of how they are met through, whether that's through money, which you might not be able to see any of this in GDP, then that is the function of the economy. That is what it's meant to be doing. It's not about whether you have a job. We have been humans for 300,000 years, however long we could call ourselves Homo sapiens. I'm not quite sure about that number. We haven't necessarily had jobs all that time. Jobs are not necessarily, a given in human society. But now the only way we talk about the economy is what we have to talk about jobs. That's the only way we also give value to people.
Mhm.
Right? That is literally like how we look at people is how much money they've made. You cannot in that metric find things like love and affection and care and informal education that you might get passed down from one generation to the other. You cannot see it. It just doesn't exist. 70% of care work is done by is unpaid, and it's
Yes,
done
yes,
by
yes.
women and girls. And also that doesn't exist. So and now I'm not quite sure what the question was.
No, so
The question was
I
whether
kind of
needs and the
provoked you,
satisfiers.
apparently. I kind of provoked you
Yeah.
by trying to create a dichotomy between needs and satisfiers. And I did that purposefully to kind of get you going, and you've done that wonderfully. And it seems to me that what we've lost in the midst of it is our capacity for imagination, our capacity for envisioning our life from the inside out, from the
Mm,
things that we long for the things that are not necessarily morally right, but aligned with life, coherent
mhm,
with life. And we've taken all of these external metrics that are rational, that are economy driven, and then we think we have to meet those satisfiers that are not necessarily satisfying us. And so there seems to be a disconnect that is culturally and created by the stories that the economy has brought to us and that we have carried forward through our own stories, through our own, even the small things, right? So children don't need toys, just being out in nature, we'll figure out ways of playing. And
yeah.
we have put toys to the hands of myself, even with my own children, in the hands of our kids that
Mm,
promote certain gender roles that assume that what are you going to be when you grow up? It's like, no, well, that's not necessarily an interesting question. It's actually a question that closes in on that story even more. So it seems like there are stories that are supporting our autonomy, our freedom, our capacity to create and bring things to life without calling ourselves poor, without judging
mm,
ourselves by external metrics, but just by the sense of how we are in the world and how we're feeling about ourselves and each other
mm.
versus all of these other things that seem to be confining us. And this is the question that your son helped you ask that led to your initiative to promote the intergenerational wisdom and kind of bring it back to our crazy beautiful lives, to connecting the weird and the wonderful. How has that process been, and what insights has that brought for you?
Oh, so we're talking about the Crazy Beautiful Worlds
Yes.
project. Yes. So that indeed was initiated by my son when he was 14 years old. And he said, I don't want to become a grown-up. Look at what the grown-ups have done to the world. And I couldn't argue with that. He was right. The grown-ups really, and particularly the grown-ups you're seeing that are foregrounded in the news and the media, they really have made a mess of things. And we've gone along with that. So I said to him, I said, okay, but there are lots of grown-ups who are fighting for the world, who want the world to be a better place. Why don't we find a way to connect you with those? So we have been making small attempts to connect young people with the older generation, to find ways of bridging that generational gap. There is really a sense of deep, deep disappointment in young people
Yes.
around the world that they're being left, how they're being commodified all the time. Um, one of the things that comes up in the workshops often is, you complain about us being on our phones, but you made this technology. And it's true. We made it. We've let it unregulated into their lives, and then we complain. And now we have to be careful with the we, of course, because not individually did I choose for mobile phones to come into our lives, but as a collective, we have allowed that to really dominate young people's development, and with terrible consequences. So the purpose of that work is really to find ways to have conversations across the generations, to try to understand not just what young people are going through, but also what can we do together? So what is it that we how can we start to look at our challenges through a different lens, beyond the divides that we have? How can we bring more compassion and wisdom to this and take a moment to breathe? Because we're all under enormous amounts of stress. So the workshops we create are really opportunities to come together to learn also about your brain. So there's a lot of research that shows how the brain responds to connection and disconnection, how you can self-regulate, co-regulate. And these are things that young people, in fact, nobody seems to be learning anywhere. You might learn this from, if you've been in therapy or if you've gone online or have an interest, but for the most part, it's not part of the curriculum. No, trying to understand why it is you're responding to certain things, and that most people would respond very similarly to those things. You're not broken. You don't need therapy. Most people under a lot of stress find it hard to think, find it hard to make the right decision, might get reactive, might even get violent. This is not necessarily, there's different conditions. Everyone is different. But on the whole, a lot of the things that we seem to be allocating to individual, characteristics or conditions are really part of the society that we're living in right now. So the workshops are, because I have a background in theatre improvisation, we make them very playful. We do games, and then we find out later how that's impacted our brains. And we give people some tools with which to just gently start to make sense of their brain body, that relationship, and really how to have a conversation with someone without falling apart, without falling apart from the other person.
Yeah.
Because the examples this is the other thing my son and I talked about a lot, is that you look at the news and you see a lot of grown-ups fighting.
Yes.
And you know what, at a time when clearly the world is feeling less safe, when as adults we should be creating safety for our young people so that they feel that they can grow into the world. Instead of that, imagine sort of like, we talk about a violent household. And actually what we are is almost demonstrating to our children a violent, abusive household. We're seeing grown-ups go to war, over things. We're seeing people use violence every time, something upsets them. So it doesn't mean that we're all violent. Around me, I'm surrounded by really wonderful, lovely, caring people. And so is my son. But he started looking at the news.
Yes.
And you're like, okay, this is not grown-ups behaving as if they have the capacity to sort of regulate their nervous systems, know how to have conversations, come to compromises, try and find a middle way. No, you're seeing grown-ups more and more demonstrating exactly the opposite. And this brings even more stress to young people. Because at the moment when we should be there saying, hey, this is really tough. Look at the mess we've made, but we're going to fix this because, look, we know how to cooperate. We're seeing exactly the opposite happening. And that layer of we were trying to, in a very small way, we were a very small organization, just say, hey, let's find a way so that there's a safe place to be around adults who really want to hear what you have to say. Because this notion that you only are worthy of listening to when you're 18 is just slightly absurd.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like at every stage of the way you are worthy of someone's attention and active listening. It doesn't mean that every stage of the way everything you say can be taken as, like I wouldn't let a 5-year-old decide, kind of like public policy. But I will listen to what a 5-year-old feels about the situation that they're in at that particular moment. And I will learn from that. And I will still have to say. And
particularly what they question as well, right?
Exactly.
So especially the things that don't make sense to people that are less conditioned by the system, because children haven't yet forgotten how to think in a more coherent and holistic way. And then they start
Exactly.
seeing the nonsensical in the extreme rationality that we're bringing to all of these silo decisions. Um, and these questions are extremely valid because they point to that
Mm,
responsibility that we have. And I don't know, I think that the definition of adult or grown up is really up for debate because you can't see the responsibility, the ability to respond. You can't see it from
yeah.
the outside, you know.
Mm,
So it's really about where is your heart at? What are you looking at? How are you relating to other
mm,
yourself, to everything else? I think there's more answers to be found in that space. And for me, that's really important as a designer, in the sense that I subscribe to the definition of design by the late Herbert Simon from the Carnegie Mellon School of Design, who said that designers are those who transform existing conditions into preferred ones. And
mm.
when you look
I
at
like
what
that.
is and you start thinking about what could be, then design can be an act of service to that which is preferable for others, not because of
Mm,
physical, normative aspects, but it's really sensing into what is needed here.
yeah, yeah.
And having the craft, having the tools as a designer, as an artist, as an improv theater, as a storyteller, are very important tools, because these are tools that empower. These are tools that
Mm,
can be unwrapped at the level of readiness that the person receiving it has
mm,
available, and then that acts as feedback to keep evolving that story together, as
mm,
opposed to here's what you need to act this way, think this way, move this way, participate this way, and die
mm,
this way.
mm,
Here it's like, okay, what might we? How might we? Why is this
mm,
so? And
mm,
really opening those spaces together,
mm,
so that we can find new forms, which is why the type of design that I do is transformation design. So across
mm,
form, transform, doing things
mm.
in different ways so that it can take new shapes. But those shapes, as they start appearing, are very vulnerable, because they are, perhaps in your words, or the Chilean you economist you referenced, are still have their feet in the mud. There's still a
Mm.
certain vulnerability to these emerging practices, these emerging ideas. How
Yeah.
might we help cultivate that?
Well, as I'm hearing you speak, there's just so much like beauty about this intention, right? It's a
Yes.
very beautiful intention. And I've been working with people who I guess we'd call change makers. They're sometimes designers, activists, people wanting the world to be a better place,
Hmm.
for about 15 years. And I have heard so many beautiful ideas and so many beautiful intentions. And one of the things that we keep coming up against is that the economy, as it now is designed, does not favor the beautiful and the caring and the artistic and the creative. Everything has to be put to profit making. So that's kind of where the economy decides for all of us what we're able to do next. Which is kind of why, because, why on earth would a storyteller be remotely interested in economics? I became interested in economics for the reasons that I described earlier about the
Yes,
climate,
yes.
but also I saw all these wonderful people around me, all these artists and musicians and creatives not being able to survive,
Yes.
even though they were really like what they were doing was kind of the foundation of what makes life worth living. Why would we have an economy if it wasn't for all the wonderful things we can experience and we can give to each other? And I thought, unless we fix this, I'm handing over a world to my son where he cannot be an artist. He cannot survive. And again, I see this over and over again. And I say, oh, what would you do if you didn't have to work for money? And it's generally not kind of the same things. If people are working for big corporations, most of the time they're like, I'm out of here. I'm going to do that beautiful thing I dreamed of when I was a teenager. And that's why it's so great to work with young people because, like you said, they're not yet conditioned into, oh, the world has to be a certain way. And that questioning that they do, and they inspire in older people that fire that we remember having, because we all had it, right? We all had this fire of the things that we wanted to do. And so that's kind of one way that I think we need to sort of keep this alive. And I think having the understanding of the limitations of the system right now, and that in order to that it's not enough for each of us individually to have had a lucky break. Okay, maybe some of us are lucky. We didn't have to work for shitty corporations. We found some good clients. But like I said, that's not happening all over the world. And there's an enormous waste of creativity because of the economic system we have. So I started to think about this a lot when I was asked by the Schumacher Institute to write a chapter for one of their books. It's called New Economies, New Systems. And I thought, okay, I said, I'll write about my experience of working on the community level. So I wrote a chapter, it's called Communities as Hothouses for Regenerative Culture. And you can read it on my blog online. And one of the things that I realized after 15 years of hearing like, oh, we really want to do this, but we don't have the money, we don't have the space, was that what's actually happening is that we're in a situation where the opportunities for us to do this stuff, the great stuff, is really shrinking. So we're seeing that what were public spaces are now kind of becoming private spaces. It's very hard to find a place that you can afford to just start a project in. I was just talking to someone now I'm constantly talking to people who have great ideas. She was selling secondhand clothes and she was just doing a pop-up shop. She said, I can't afford to have my own shop. And there's countless people with small things that if we collectively got together, we might have some power.
Yes.
But the reality is that what we're seeing is wealth being funneled to the top, and that wealth is being used really to buy up the spaces that, to kind of push property prices up. And then, it doesn't matter how many great ideas you have. If you don't have a place to do them in, then they're not going to come off the ground. If you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week in a job to pay the rent, you're not going to have time. So there's this time and space kind of like thing that's being shrunk by the system as it is. So we have to find ways to break that. And the way to break that, I think, is about us coming together in large groups to really demand what is ours, which is, to a certain extent, the commons. We need to find places where we can have public spaces where we can do the work that we need to do together that isn't always put through that corporate matrix. But that means we have to feel entitled to that. And that is one of the biggest problems that I feel we come up against, particularly in people who are fairly privileged, where the system is working well enough. The idea that we would come together in large enough groups to demand that we have a right to public spaces, to clean air, to clean water, that this cannot be bought. There's certain things that should not be on the market. And that requires us to think differently about what should be bought and what should be sold. And that is part of that conditioning and part of that story. And we've all been raised in a culture that is trying to put a price tag on everything. And more things have to have a price tag on them. And then we start to think, oh, this is normal, So if you're born into that, you would think that is normal. But that isn't necessarily the only way that, societies can be organized.
No, certainly not. I think we need to remind ourselves that we have a choice. We've forgotten we've had a choice. I mean, the default is so strong, and we keep carrying this story forward. Sort of signaling at the have-nots, saying there's something missing there, whereas actually it's the other way around, and it takes very long for that to happen. Also because the culture is becoming homogeneous, is becoming rather similar instead of multifaceted, pluriversal. And we buy into this by being perfectionistic. So this podcast wouldn't exist if I were still thinking about it. I think the power of design is that we do. And then we're like, okay, that's an opportunity for learning. Next time it can be better. But if you don't do it, you can't get better. And I think that there is such hesitance to break away from what is considered normal, which is not normal. It's just bloody normative. It's just bloody dogmatic. There's nothing normal about normality.
Mm.
I mean, normality doesn't exist. At least it doesn't exist for me. The minute you try and fit in, you can't. You sort of bring your talent out, bring your story out, bring your color out into the world, which is actually what we need in order to start thriving.
Mm. One of the things I've become really interested in all this work is trying to understand human nature and why it is that people do or don't do, why it is that people find that they can act and or they can't act. And it seems to me that there are a number of factors, like I said, the shrinking of our worlds by, technology and by the economic system, by land grabs, etc. But there's also, I think that there's a lot of isolation, and we're not meant to be acting in isolation.
Yes.
So the more we kind of get on our phones and we have this little thing that sort of seems to, it pseudo satisfies a need, but it doesn't really satisfy the need, then we're isolated from each other and we don't feel kind of the presence of other people and being sort of buoyed up and supported in real life. So one of the things that I often talk about is the small thing we can do is connecting to somebody.
Yes.
Is actually because the nervous system also responds. I mean, connecting as much as possible in real life with real people. And that is a kind of a skill that I think is under threat by all this online. Really, it's just remarkable how, I talk about it with my friends, like, in the past, you just have to knock on someone's door because you have to knock on someone's door to see them, or at least pick up the phone. And now, literally, you can have endless sort of WhatsApp toing and froing and not see someone for weeks. And it gives a sense that you've connected, but have you? Is that the kind of connection that we're going to find satisfying? Or are we going to say, actually, we need more? We need to really be with each other. And so that's, again, where you get that shifting baseline of what it means to be truly connected and be really present with someone. And that's why it's so important to actually take a moment to think, what does it feel like to really satisfy this need? How does it feel? And can I remember a time when that really happened? Because often when we stop and think, oh, how does it really feel to meet my needs, or whatever, whichever one of those needs, quite often, even those of us who are wealthy find that they're not being adequately met in the cultures that we've created. So that is something that we have to, I think, have time for, to sort of feel what that is. Because right now, a lot of the way that we consume, a lot of what's driving the environmental crisis is the fact that we pseudo satisfy our needs by consuming. We don't like, okay, this is what's on offer. That's what the economic system does. It says, don't look that way. That's already been taken from you. The commons is gone. The family is gone. The community is gone. But hey, here, you can buy this. Okay, you're overweight, here, buy a pill. Don't start questioning the food system and why it is that, you find it hard to actually access really healthy food for your body or opportunities to exercise. Just look this way and we'll give you a pill. And this is not to say that people don't have choice, but they're fighting against an absolutely colossal machinery
Yes.
of advertising
Yeah.
every single day. And now they're fighting that in isolation. Like, it's not like, oh, you and I are together watching an ad. You're probably on your phone on your own watching an ad, especially for Corolla,
Yes.
especially
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
people.
That's
And that is incredibly hard. And the only way to pull ourselves out is to pull ourselves out of that together. And not to tell people, oh, here's another app, here's another thing to keep you off your phone. I think the thing is community. And
yes.
that community needs a space. So then we get full circle of like, community needs a space. So that means we're going to have to start fighting to get that space back. They're not going to just hand it over nicely. I think we have to really think about, what are we going to do to reclaim what is ours as people?
Yeah. And I think that the value of connection is really important. You mentioned at the beginning listening to Al Gore and The Inconvenient Truth, and how you looked at the story and the narrative structure, and you thought, well, he's not really sort of reaching the spot, right? The point of transformation where there is a realization that says, hey, wait, this is the other way. It's just sort of making me sad because he's bringing like really confronting news, but then now what? And it seems to me that that aside from the aspect of connection and relationship, there is also an element of scale. It seems like
Mm.
you said we're fighting with a machinery that is much, much bigger than we are, and therefore we feel vulnerable, we feel incapable, we feel ill-equipped really to address this, and then we give up,
Mm.
and therefore reinforce the narrative, the cultural narrative that is keeping us trapped. How might we sort of bring that scale and these connections into our own spaces, into our own lives? I mean, we do have technology, and you said it yourself, going online was surprisingly effective because it's a medium in which people can listen. And when we can put the attention to the human story, then there is an aspect of scale that seems to start working because we can carry it in our hearts and we can carry it into our lives. So there are like alternative mechanisms that are appearing as we do these things. Do you have examples of things that happen perhaps in your work or as you tell the stories, or that examples of things you see in nature that can help us inspire this movement? Like, for example, how do you know when, as a storyteller, as a contadora, you actually touch someone? How do you, and what's the feedback? How do you know? How can you
Yeah,
tell?
see, that's very interesting. So I find the idea of talking about scale really interesting, and I agree with you that technology can help us scale certain things up. And then
The
I also
reach,
think
the reach, but not the
the reach.
simplicity.
No, no, no. But there's
No.
deepening, isn't there?
Yes,
There's
yes.
scale and then there's deepening. And I think that what we have to be careful of is not to sacrifice deepening at the altar of scale.
Yes.
But I think that bearing that in mind, I do think those things are, can happen. But the deepening requires time. And that is what often people say, oh, I don't have time. So I talk to activists about stuff. Oh, we don't have time for any kind of healing. So in my work, I talk about, the regenerative triad, which
Yes.
means that, we restore justice. That means you get on the barricade, but you also need to heal. You also need to connect in your community. And often we're in one of those corners, but we're not seeing how they all fit together. So again, like sometimes it's just about having a conversation that you are quite invested in, that you're not that's not shallow, being willing to sort of talk to someone, maybe even you've had a disagreement with, and being really invested in finding a way through that. And that's really a muscle that we need to
Mm.
start to practice. And because if we can start doing that on an individual level, then we can start modeling that. And also we get the experience that conflict isn't necessarily the end of it isn't splitting apart. It's like, oh, I found this really uncomfortable about you. And oh no, we're going to get through this. We're not going to split apart. We're going to find who we are after this conversation. There is still going to be us after this conversation. It's not just going to be two separate entities. And it makes me think about what in nature inspires me is this concept, which I've been thinking about for a lot, is it's called thigmomorphogenesis, and it's basically what a tree does when it gets buffeted by the wind. It starts to grow a thicker trunk
Hmm.
to strengthen itself. So if you have a tree that's got greenhouse, it will grow spindly because it doesn't get buffeted. It doesn't get that motion, that movement, that touch. And I think that us as humans, we kind of need some of that in our own lives. We need
Yes.
friction
Yes.
to grow. We need to have the conversation and come through it. We need to stay with the difficulties and learn and develop. We need to not move away from the challenges and find the easy way. We need to say, this is a challenge I'm willing to take on, and maybe take on with others. And then we grow through that. And what we've done is created a world and an ideology, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley, that the ultimate purpose of human existence is to make everything frictionless and easy. So now you see this thing where you press a button and the whole world starts to move around you. The amount of things we can now do on our screens, or we can do in our kitchens by pressing buttons, which in the past we had to be engaged with. We had to feel those things. There's a mechanical way of doing it. I have to get my body involved. I start to know the edges of myself. I start to know the edges of my ecology. If I pollute the river, I cannot drink the water. All of those things have been taken away from us. We have basically lengthened the feedback loop between our actions and the consequences, so stretch it so far that we don't feel that anymore.
Yes.
When I go and buy something from a shop, I can't feel who made that. I can't feel what they've suffered. Probably they've suffered a lot, because if I can get it cheap, that's because it's
Yes.
cost them.
Mm.
And so this idea of a frictionless world is actually totally not in touch with reality of living on a finite planet. And it comes more and more at the cost of others. If I said this to my son, I said, if it's easy for you, it's because someone else is doing the work. Another person, the earth is working harder so that you can have it easier. And that goes for all of us. So our ease comes at the expense. So this idea that actually the tree grows through that friction, I think we need to sort of start welcoming that idea into our lives, that actually it's not a bad thing if friction comes our way, and that we can rise to that. We're up for that. It's good for us to rise up to the challenge. Of course, that's different from having hardship. Hardship is
No,
the kind of
of course,
far
yeah, yeah.
end, but there has to be a balanced friction between us and the world, so that we know that we're living on a finite planet, and a certain amount of work goes into keeping ourselves alive, and a certain amount of work goes into growing a community. To be together means you're going to have to be with people who are not like you, and they're going to say things that are upsetting, and you have to suck it up sometimes and just be with it and appreciate what you can appreciate about the people around
That's
you.
right. I think that this appreciation is the new commons, in the sense that we still need the sort of physical commons, of course, because, we're made of flesh and blood, and we have to eat, and we have to, go through our lives as living beings. But there is also this frictionlessness has to do with accepting the difference, as opposed to embracing the commonalities that we have, and embracing the fact that even if something irritates you, there is a point of contact. And these points of contacts are really where we start rebuilding, because we start rebuilding from common ground. You can't rebuild from difference. I mean, regeneration requires this contact, requires this friction. I mean, friction also has led us to finding fire, which was a really good technology for us as humans, so not necessarily a bad thing. And to your point of trees, I mean, I live in the forest, so I spend a lot of time, looking at the natural process and the aliveness of the forest is. And one of the interesting thing about trees, aside of this, I wrote it, thigmomorphogenesis. I had to look at my notes. Is also that trees that grow in groups grow straight. So crooked trees are trees that are alone, and they seem to be sort of finding, like, where are the others? Where are other places? How do I orient? But when they are growing in the forest environment, they grow together and they support each other in the process of growth. Of course, we have the mycelium and the root system and all these things that we always talk about, but it's also having others becomes a reference to, as you say, the edges of ourselves, and the comprehension that we are not limitless, and that we can't do everything, and that we need each other, and that this interdependency is a good thing. It's not a codependency, it's an interdependency. It's a give and a take and a balancing act of being in the world, and we've totally forgotten this. We've attributed things like privilege to, oh, you've obviously worked hard. No, not really. It's, it's where I was born and the opportunities that came with that. I'd be
Mm.
really amiss to think that where I've gotten to in life is only up to me. So of
Mm.
course not. And so realizing that we can be that for one another is so important. I love the example of the thigmomorphogenesis, I think.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
why I
it's
stopped coloring my hair for sure, to show that I've done my bit at thigmomorphogenesis.
yes. But also like this idea of like that we're not supposed to grow old.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
not so we have to like this is the other thing coming out of
yes,
Silicon Valley is this idea of living forever. Like
yeah,
why? The
yes,
beauty of things is that they end. That is the specialness of them.
yes,
If we had and then we would have to completely reconfigure the value of things.
yes,
So it's in fact there's a wonderful book called What We Leave Behind by Derek Jensen, Eric
yes,
McBay. And have you read it?
yes, yes. But
Yeah,
I make notes for our show notes as well, so that we can
yeah.
reference it to people. Yes, what we leave behind.
And in one of the kind of premises of that book is that the problems we're facing is because we are rejecting the cycle of life, which includes death.
Yes,
We're making things that will never die. We have these plastics in the environment that are not going to go away for millions of years. And that is the earth cannot sustain that because life is cyclical.
yes,
Death is part of living. And I remember reading that book afterwards thinking it was the first time where I felt a real peace around this notion of dying. Not that I wanted to not be here, but I thought, oh my God, I am actually going to be food for something else in the world.
yes, yes,
And that is the natural course of things. And we have this very death kind of averse society. And I think we really need to start, you know, bringing death as a natural part of things, celebrating it in a way that, allows us to understand that that is the destination for all of us. That is the one certainty we all have.
yes.
And, and that we have to find a way of making our relationship with that more beautiful again and more accepting rather than trying to compensate for that reality and that what we feel as terror by creating more things in the
Yes.
world because there is no escaping it. There is no
No, for
escaping
sure.
it.
And I think that's probably sort of a whole new episode in and of itself, but it's this same reductionistic thinking, this economic thinking, as in the capitalistic economic model, that has led us to make it invisible and that we've forgotten because most people think that the opposite of death is life.
Mm-hmm.
But the opposite of death is birth.
Mm.
Life is.
Mm. Yeah.
Life is always.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it's not that it ends with death. It's just that it continues as a cycle that is transcended into a different form. And then
Mm.
it starts again, and then there's birth again. And that's why spending time in the forest for me is so nurturing because it's a reminder of this, that things are continuously evolving, continuously transforming, and so are we.
Mm.
Allowing for that space of change and transformation is so important in order to be of service to life
Mm.
and to
Yeah.
one another, and to really see ourselves as compost allows us to be compassionate
Mm.
in the mirror and in our conversations and interactions as well.
Mm. Yeah.
So let's imagine that we fast forward, say, another 15 years, and then by that time, your son will be 24, or maybe even further into the future.
Maybe
Uh,
34.
oh, 34, sorry.
Yeah.
And that people, yes, and that people will have been learning from these things that we talked about, barefoot economics, bringing back the human scale, that we will have started tuning into one another intergenerationally and learning from one another. What might society look like? Because some things are gone, some things are dead. I mean, we talked about the commons as in the land, and clearly those systems seem fairly rigidly in place. So maybe there's
Mm.
no going back to that kind of openness and freedom and collaboration. But maybe new things will emerge. What might things look like in, say, 15 years?
if in an ideal situation
Yes,
or
yes,
what I'm imagining.
yes. Let's
In
keep
an
the
ideal
optimism going.
situation, there is no compromising on the land. The land will have to belong to the people again. That is the foundation of our existence. And this is the thing that people, if having kind of been raised in a culture for most of us where we don't have that contact and we don't have that real sense of everything that we enjoy in the world comes from the land, we might think, oh yeah, we can somehow manage that in another way. But the trajectory of the system as it is, which is a power over system that is seeking
Yes.
to make profit from
Hmm.
everything it can get its hands on, is that those who own the land really will control everything. It's ultimately, I mean, what they're looking at in Silicon Valley, the billionaires, is how are they going to keep the people guarding their underground bunkers fed? That is just, sorry, that is the reality of what's going on right now. They ask people, how do I design this world for the future? Because they kind of know what's coming our way. So the ideal situation is that somehow we interrupt that flow. Somehow we remember that we are many and they are few, and we really remember it. And we have got to a point where we have put um, structures in place where we can have proper democracies, proper ways of deciding what it is that's good for all of us. And I think it's very hard to imagine that right now because we have these power over systems, and we get consulted once every 4 years to put a cross somewhere, but I think we have to imagine that there are ways of organizing that really involve us
Yes.
and that involve us to the smallest level, and that we raise our children so that they have a sense that, oh, my voice matters. Okay, and now I'm getting older, and now I have more responsibilities, and my voice still matters. And then, the things that I need are going to be available to me because I have, I want to be careful with the word right, but
You belong.
yes, I belong on this earth, and I should be able to feed
Of
myself.
course.
Whereas like this idea that some people are poor and some people are rich just because that's the way things are, and that you should accept where you are. And even the poverties that we are experiencing now, because in the human scale development framework, poverty isn't just that you can't feed yourself, poverty is also loneliness.
Yes, of
Poverty is
course.
feeling disconnected. And so that we start to feel, these 9 needs, can be quite humbly met. So we can have a future in which, no, we're not all each going to have individual cars. We're not each going to have endless technology, but we're going to meet our needs in a way that is in harmony with the earth and with each other. And that means a real, complete reimagining of those things. And I think it's possible if we steer the conversation away from the satisfiers towards the needs.
Yes.
And we start to build bridges around, I have the same needs as you. I get you. I get you on that level. Let's work out together how you're going to be able to meet your needs in a sustainable way, because I don't want you to not have your needs met. And if we can say that to each other and really mean that, then I think we can build a bridge between each other. But right now, what the story that we have is that if you win, I lose. Now, how is that going to create a bridge? And that's the story that is being told right now,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
it's a zero-sum game. And that is not going to bring us together enough or at all in order to really do the work that's needed right now. And that work is really about us coming together and, dare I say it, dismantling capitalism.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll just throw that in
Well,
there.
finding new forms. I mean, really, I mean, this is not working, and we have
Yeah.
to admit that. And as we've often quoted Bucky Fuller, Buckminster Fuller, who's was an American architect, and he always said, I mean, there's enough for everyone, but we have to also look at creating new systems that render the current obsolete.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
as we literally reprogram our minds to see
Mm.
how things can be done differently by feeling into what we have in common, by feeling into the importance of everyone's needs being met. Because in the end,
Mm.
it's very egoistical to make sure that everyone's needs are met. I mean, for me, really, I mean, I pay a lot of taxes in the Netherlands, and I'm happy to do that because I know that it means that other people are taken care of.
Mm,
Aside from the sort of beauty of that, there's also that's something that's less burdening to me. So
mm,
ideally, we're going to move into a model that doesn't necessitate that interface where we can do it for one another. Like, why should we be sort of doing all of the whole of money dance where we can actually be there for one another? I love the future that is more shared and more collaborative
mm.
and more compassionate that you're showing us. So tell us about where people can find your work before I ask you the last question.
Well, I have a few different things. So, my online Beautiful Economies Learning Lab is at www.beautifuleconomies.com, and Crazy Beautiful World, crazybeautiful.world.
We will add those to the show notes. We'll also add some references that you gave. Do you have also a place where people can find, because you mentioned you're doing a tour? Yes.
Called www.unearthedshow.com.
Great. We'll add that as well. So I'll ask you the question with which we always close the episodes, and that's a question based on an idea that I brought in a book about 11 years ago called The Quest for Questions. So when we are looking forward into the unknown, then we don't have answers. We have all of these questions bubbling up in us as to where might this lead us. What is your next question?
My next question. Like, how can we find joy and meaning in an imperfect world?
I love that question. I love it. And the beauty of the quest for questions is that then that leads to more questions and more questions, and us
Yeah.
questioning everything and challenging everything. And maybe that will be the way to dismantle the capitalistic model that is really keeping us really so confined. Thank you so much.
Mm.
And thank you
Oh,
for being
thank
with
you.
us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you and getting to know you.